Hard to follow that. We didn't compare notes, by the way. Good morning. Thank you for coming. My father loved St. Peter's. It was his spiritual home for over 50 years. He met my mother, Mary, here in the late 60s, in the days of the old church. While this building was under construction, we lived in the wilderness, New Haven and Springfield, Illinois. Once the new church was finished, though, we came right back. Peter was devoted to St. Peter's. He sang in the choir for many years. He served on several committees over the years. He taught Sunday school, and he made many of his best lifelong friends here. When he and my mother divorced, he found an apartment just a block away where he lived for over 20 years. During COVID, you broadcast video from previous year's services, and when I would tune in, I would often see him right up here in the front, week after week. Whenever he was in the city, he was here if he was able to. My father trained as a scientist. He did a PhD in biochemistry, and he worked as a medical writer for much of his life. He valued knowledge and rationality. From an early age, he and I discussed the tension between faith and reason. As I started to develop an interest in science of my own, he gave me books on the topic. We discussed the historical Jesus, metaphorical versus literal readings of the Bible, all that whole thing. As he grew older, he became fascinated with this tension between his strong faith and his scientific mindset. If you ever discussed faith with him, you probably heard him talk about this. He may have even given you a reading assignment about it. He gave me several. It was one of the ways that he showed us his love. Some of those reading assignments I'm still working on. I'll get to it, Dad. Peter had cerebral palsy, which was caused by a birth injury. It caused his left side to be underdeveloped. His left leg was much shorter than his right, and his left hand was very weak. He was a little bit asymmetrical. I remember a few family vacations where this made a difference. We went cross-country skiing in Vermont a few times, and Peter would go snowshoeing. We went kayaking, and his kayak would flip over and over and over. Nathaniel and I had to keep jumping into the water to flip him back right side up. And by the end of it, we were all exhausted, Peter most of all. The thing about it was, he didn't avoid those situations. And if he was uncomfortable, he didn't show it. In fact, he planned those trips, and he dove right in. He loved to travel, and he loved Europe. As a young man, he traveled through France, visiting dozens of vineyards, as Nathaniel talked about there, learning all about wine. Pre-internet days, I too remember him poring over guidebooks for months, finding the perfect places to stay on family trips. An abbey in Jerusalem, a little family-owned hotel in Paris. He would plan these trips at an incredible level of detail to make the trips as special as possible. This was another way he showed his love. Sometimes I mean taking a day trip out to a car museum to visit Model Ts and cars from the 20s and 30s, or spending a day kayaking. Special treats that I still remember decades later. He and Franklin continued this tradition in later years. I know they repeated the vineyard trip, and they took many other trips together. And I know that Peter planned some of them in that kind of detail because Franklin would needle him about going to some gray little village somewhere here or there that had caught Peter's attention. One special thing that Peter and Franklin did a few times was to do a crossing. Before they did it, I didn't even know that was a thing. They didn't do cruisings, just crossings from Europe back to America, which were a little bit more fancy, a little more special. That was the right kind of special for them. He and Franklin both enjoyed those a lot. My dad loved the ocean, and he loved the water. When we were growing up, we had a bungalow in Breezy Point, where we spent our summers playing in the sand and swimming in the ocean. Some of you may have joined my parents there. I remember many summer evenings at the beach, my dad laughing with friends with a glass of wine in his hand. Probably because of his cerebral palsy, I never really thought of my father as fit or athletic. But when I was a teenager, he would always leave early in the morning to go for a swim before work. In his later years, he and Franklin were snowbirds, and he split his time between the beach in East Hampton in the summer and the beach in Fort Lauderdale in the winter. It was subtle. You might not have known this about him, but he loved the ocean and the water. It was a big, quiet part of his life. My father was a gay man He was closeted for much of his life. His father, an officer in the Army Corps of Engineers, passed away when he was 11. His mother remarried, and they moved from San Francisco to Fort Benning, Georgia, to live in base housing, where he went through puberty and realized he was gay. This was a sad, lonely time for him, and he spent much of it tucked away listening to music, as teenagers do. Though for him it was classical music, his favorite, rather than rock and roll. It was something that he had a lifelong love for. In the 60s, he came to New York City. He joined St. Peter's, met my mother. They got married and started a family. That was the thing that people did back then. I know that this decision is controversial to some of you, but he was a loving and caring husband and father. Though I know that he struggled on and off with depression, I didn't know why. When Nathaniel and I were grown, he decided to come out of the closet to us. He came out to me, appropriately enough, at a meticulously planned family trip. Not long after that, he and my mother got divorced, and they sold the place at Breezy Point. That was sad, but for the best. That place burned down in Hurricane Sandy. Not long after that, he met Franklin, and they started their life together, which lasted for about 20 years. Their life was full of travel, culture, friendships, and deep, deep love. He would forward a Bible newsletter that he subscribed to me and to a long list of friends. He would call me in the winter and tell me how warm it was at the beach in Fort Lauderdale. And he would tell me how much he enjoyed where he was now. Every year he would buy a pile of books for Luke. Most of these books were far too old for Luke when he bought them, but we still have them. And as Luke gets older, they'll be there for him. Peter and Franklin split their time between several different places, coming to New York mostly for special occasions, theater tickets, doctor's appointments, Easter. In the last year of their lives, though, they were more anchored here in New York City, and we were able to spend more time with them. One way we did that was to come here, to St. Peter's, with Peter. It's true, you can check the tapes. Franklin and Peter were like peas in a pod, together pretty much every day for those 20 years. They died within a few weeks of each other, just about exactly 2 years ago, coping with their own end in the middle of the first big wave of COVID that swept over us here in New York. My father is interred in the columbarium. It was quite a while ago now, actually. He's over there, next to my mother, here in St. Peter's. He wanted to donate his body to science and for us to have a memorial service after science was done with him. Things didn't quite work out that way, but it's okay. He wasn't really sentimental about what happened to his body after he died, but he did create one last experience for us. This service. With some of his favorite readings and his favorite hymns. I hope that you were moved by it and that you remember Peter fondly. He would have liked that. I hope that we can soon raise a glass of wine, preferably French, to Peter and to Franklin and to other lost friends and family, and remember all of the joyous experiences that they shared with us. Thank you.